Hello, this is a Yale SOM Exchange webinar. My name is Heidi Brooks, and I'm here to talk with you about power. We decided to call this webinar, Do I Even Want Power? The reason for that is that I spend most of my time talking with, teaching, sometimes advising people who want to have a positive impact on the world. The School of Management here at Yale has a mission of educating leaders for business and society. And many of the students, of course, come with this idea of wanting to have a positive impact in their organizations and on the larger community and society of the world as they imagine it. So when I talk with people who care about having a positive impact on the world, they talk about and care deeply about bringing the values that they hold near and dear to fruition in the world. They really want those values to be able to show up in a meaningful way in their work, in their personal lives, and in their organizations. And so sometimes they worry about power, about how working in an organization with a set of values that sometimes aligns and sometimes doesn't will squeeze them. Will press them to be someone whom they're not. So they worry about power. They worry about being perceived as pursuing power, as though that kind of might mean something that hinders their the reputation they want to be pursuing according to their values. I really wanted to speak to people about wanting power, pursuing it, about the feelings people have about having power when they need it, about not having it when they need it. We have so many feelings about power and so many ideas about power. So I was excited to talk about this. I want to talk to people who have mixed feelings, and most of us do. When I put out the title about this webinar, Do I Even Want Power?, I handed it over to someone who's in charge of my social media. On the private side. We had just started working together, and he gave me back a kind of promotion, and I read it, and it very simply said, do I want power? He removed the word even, which, kind of a minor change perhaps, but had a big meaning change for me. And the next line said, most people do. And so the talk he was promoting was going to be to speak to a very different audience, what I considered a much more kind of conventional interpretation of power. And then I wondered, does he think that's my perspective on power? Does he think that I really want people to somewhat ruthlessly pursue power and assume that everyone wants power without a more complex interpretation? Where would he get that idea from? And I realized that I hadn't necessarily influenced him enough for him to overcome the stereotype that he may have had about what a professor at a major business school would say about power. I realized that we basically needed to talk. We were just getting to know each other, and we needed to talk seriously, immediately. This conversation matters to me. He and I had a great conversation. I think we have a nice future in what we can create together. But I really have to own that I hadn't been managing my power with him. How could he possibly be influenced by my ideas when I hadn't really made them available to him through conversation or necessarily through specific publications on this topic? He used what information he had available. And while it felt like a miss to me, I get where he's coming from, or was coming from. And it tells an important story about why it's important for us to pay attention to influence and to power, and for us to reveal to others our perspective on power, our everyday assumptions and conventions about how power works and what it means don't always serve us. So I have some slides for you here today. I'm going to work and advance right through those so that we can actually set the stage for the conversation. People have sent in questions, some fantastic questions, a number of tough questions. I want to welcome your questions at any time during the webinar. Part of that is, that's the spirit of this place and this webinar, and there's an explicit invitation for you to impact it. And it's also, you know, it really matters to me to walk the talk. Part of what I want to talk with you about is about shared and collaborative power. So I want to immediately invite you to impact this space with your questions. We have a number of great ones already. I work in the space of everyday leadership, less about more strategic, high-level leadership in my direct teaching and advising, and more about the everyday leadership, the kind of the psychology of leadership. I put here 3 examples of where I tend to comment and play and advise and teach. Questions about how we communicate, how we receive communication, understand it, what communication means. I teach a course that's about interpersonal and group dynamics. We pay a lot of attention to communication. We also pay a lot of attention to feedback and decision making. So those are 3 examples of the kind of domain where in the everyday we're always communicating, where feedback is always available to us, and we're probably giving less feedback than we need to, but we're always giving feedback and dealing with feedback and making decisions. These are all arenas in which we can pay attention to the way that power plays out on an everyday basis. There are also junctures in which, when power is not playing out well, doesn't feel fair or equitable, or is being distributed, often unconsciously, in a way that we might not feel great about at the end of the day, with respect to the kind of values conversation that I was referencing. We can see these things happening at these everyday junctures. So I want to invite you to pay attention to communication norms in the way that you're working and leading and interacting, how feedback is working for you in your life, whether you're thinking about feedback that you're receiving or feedback that you're giving, and decisions that are on your plate. Who's involved? Who needs to be involved? Who's missing? And what kind of power is being enacted there? So let's take some of these ideas a little bit further. I'd like to invite you to take a deep breath with me. I'm going to read you a piece of poetry. And it will give us a chance to look at the content of the poem, but it'll also give us a chance to introduce a mindset that invites wisdom. There's nothing for anyone here, perhaps except me, to perform or produce or decide or to necessarily give feedback on. So I really want you to be able to take this material in with an open mind. I often read poetry in the MBA classrooms and in advisory spaces with senior executives. It expands our mind and heart and invites the spirit of the artist to think more broadly. So here's a piece that resonates with me. Donna Markova. I will not die an unlived life. I will not live in fear of falling or catching fire. I choose to inhabit my days to allow my living to open me, to make me less afraid, more accessible, to loosen my heart until it becomes a wing, a torch, a promise. This next line is perhaps the most important for our conversation about power. I choose to risk my significance. I choose to risk my significance to live so that which came to me as seed goes to the next as blossom, and that which came to me as blossom goes on as fruit. So there's a piece there for you to just sink into. It tends to be a piece that resonates with me, especially the line that I pointed out about I choose to risk my significance, which is for me a question of power. So I will occasionally pause to see that there are some questions coming in. I have questions that came in advance. And we have a number of questions coming in already. I'm going to set a little bit more stage before I take this first question. And the first question is really why talk about power? Like, why is this an important topic? We spend a lot of time actually avoiding talking about power. We are pretty skilled at avoiding talking about power and status. And I think there's some cost to us. So why talk about it? Let's see if we can answer that question. It helps for us to have a definition of power. We, in a course here that I teach with Michael Krauss and Julia DiBignino, use this definition. This definition from Keltner and colleagues, the capacity to control or influence the rewards and punishments experienced by others. Let me read that more fluently. The capacity to control or influence the rewards and punishments experienced by others. So, okay, what does that mean? We're really talking about on an everyday basis that you actually can have some impact on how other people experience whatever is valued as reward or what people are trying to experience as punishment. So it's really an important idea. Let's see if we can actually make it a little simpler. When we ask people what is power without giving them any definition, we have been doing this for a number of years. Look at what happens. People talk about concepts that wrap up with this term of assertiveness or confident, Machiavellian. You can see it kind of continues from there. Not exactly a bunch of positive terms. It's actually really striking and quite disturbing. We could see this one hope word. This one word that might offer us a little bit of hope, ethical. But it's really the only one in the series of when we ask people this open question that comes out as with a positive valence. So we often don't talk about power because we have pretty negative ideas of what power means. And that's concerning because power is actually pretty inevitable. We actually have to deal with power. I tend to think of power in a pretty simple way. I think of power as impact, and hope that people who care about having impact on the world be willing to consider, at least during this conversation today, how it is that a pursuit of power might actually help you to have the impact that you need and want very much to have across your career. I don't take it as an easy question. I basically agree with some of the scholars in this space, including Keltner, who tend to think of power as more of a kind of necessary evil, perhaps, that it comes with its own dilemmas. And so I understand the negative words that get ascribed here. And yet, if those people with a sense of integrity and who are really caring about power that's collaborative and mutual and good for humanity, if you will, don't have the power and influence to be able to create impact, we're in trouble. So I really want to encourage people who want to have an impact to be able to, and who are connected to a set of values, and we're all connected to a set of values. I want people to be able to have influence in a way that's aligned with their values. So let's keep going on this conversation, and then I'm going to take a couple of questions, or a couple more definitions out there. In the course that I referenced that is called Power and Politics at Yale that we teach, we use a basic framework which has power as two dimensions. The two dimensions are on the x-axis connection, on the y-axis strength. And this is really suggesting that power is not just about force, a kind of Machiavellian idea. But it really includes these ideas of connecting by being more trustworthy and emotionally intelligent, that we actually can't influence people unless we can connect with them. We can have influence over them, but it's very difficult to have influence with people and to actually have impact on them in a relational fashion without creating some form of connection. So for those of you who care about building a kind of power with, this is the axis to really pay a lot of attention to. But you can't do it really without attention to the other axis, which is about strength. And in strength, we really want you to be able to have some sense of assertiveness and to be able to have the confidence and a bit of grit and determination. So for some reason that's not showing very easily on the slide, which keeps advancing itself. But with these two axes really matter. So we really want to talk about power as having two dimensions. In our stereotypes and ideas of power, we overemphasize the x-axis, this dimension of strength. And particularly, we overemphasize strength as almost a competitive kind of zero-sum concept of strength over people. So we have a question that's asking, what role does vulnerability play in creating power individually and collectively? Someone asking about, how is vulnerability seen, including across different cultures, and that there are some cultures where vulnerability is seen as weakness. So, as we talk about some of the common concerns, I would say this is one of them, that people get worried about a vulnerability because we all have vulnerabilities. And so we get into this game of, which is about hiding our vulnerabilities, hiding weaknesses. And so, while this makes sense, if the display of power is all about displaying strength, it tends to reduce a sense of connection for people. So vulnerability is actually quite important as a process. It's not important as an outcome. It's important as a process because vulnerability gives people access to what you care about. And really want to pay attention to this idea of risking your significance when we talk about vulnerability. Our everyday common convention is that vulnerability is a weakness at work, really puts us a little bit at risk itself when we are actually spending most of our time trying to hide anything where we feel vulnerable. People often don't share information or talk about what they value most if they perceive it as not the kind of zeitgeist. And so people wind up not being able to connect with each other in authentic and real ways. And so what feels vulnerable to a single person may actually not look like vulnerability from the other side. When someone's sharing something that may feel vulnerable to them, it often looks like courage from the other side. So we tend to kind of misjudge the opportunities for building a kind of shared power and connection by perceiving vulnerability as weakness and revealing of things that matter to us as vulnerability. We actually need to know each other so we can actually build the kind of trustworthiness that I was talking about on the x-axis in our power diagram that I shared with you. So it's really something worth talking about. However, the end of this question is, how can that be changed? And so if we talk about within a team, we can actually focus on concepts of psychological safety. So that brings us to some of what I was hoping to put in front of you. I think there are some ways that you can think about power as impact and some skills that can help you to create a kind of personal power and to be able to pursue the kind of personal power that will build power that's more mutual and collaborative, that can help us to be able to support processes of innovation, that can help people to bring their voices to the table. And so the vulnerability question is related to this. Here are the 4 or 5 things that I think it might help to pay attention to. So we're going to talk about each of these. The first is about building awareness of your impact. Then we want to talk about the piece that I just named, this idea of creating psychological safety. Part of the power model that I mentioned is also about connection. So I have here demonstrating empathy. Notice it says demonstrate empathy, not just have empathy, because people need to understand where you're coming from. Really want to encourage us to be involved with feedback that promotes kind of mutual power, and really thinking about developing alliances that support and evolve you and perhaps your teams. This whole list I'm going to go through now, and then we'll take some more questions. So as a perspective, it's really worth asking, what is the water that you're swimming in? What's the culture that you're part of? And here in this depiction, we of course have the, a kind of common comic that asks people to think a little bit about the conditions in which you are functioning. I really want to name for people the idea that we often don't notice the assumptions of the cultures that we're part of, the organizational cultures, the family culture that we've come from, our cultures of origin related to country and city and region of the world. And yet, these contexts are having a big impact on us. So the assumptions that go with power and the way that it's translated and received and interpreted and understood and valued often come from a kind of a set of assumptions that are hard to observe. So it's a starting place. See if we can bring awareness and discussability to these kind of conversations. That makes the next piece around building awareness of your impact possible, because your impact will be perceived within the context in which you work. One of the best ways to think about this, I think, is impact as being affective, especially since part of building power is about connecting with people effectively. The invitation here is to think about how it is that people are impacted by you. Do you have a sense of awareness of how you leave people feeling? With this nice Maya Angelou quote, that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. We tend to have a kind of social memory of what it feels like to be with someone. And so, if power is impact, and power is also granted by others, power can't so much be taken. And you can use power over people, but I think that's a very short-lived power. And in some ways, you actually have to have some sort of positional authority, or people have to allow you to take that. Or there has to be a system that allows for power over to be able to engage that. But if we really want to think about power that's granted and feels mutual, leaves people with a sense of dignity and respect, and promotes that norm in the organizational cultures and teams that you're part of, we really want to pay attention to the affective dimensions of how we make people feel, of our everyday impact. So there's the piece, the first piece. I want to talk with you a little bit about building a kind of self-awareness of your impact. That if you are someone who thinks a lot about you actually enjoy kind of journaling or something like that, you may think of yourself as quite self-aware, and may be. Tasha Eurich put out this nice piece in HBR that I think is a useful way for us to bring the kind of awareness that I'm really talking about in this domain about power. In this domain, and you can look at this slide, I want to go straight to the upper right-hand quadrant, which is really about being aware of your impact on others. So you not only have a curiosity about your impact, but you're particularly curious about how it is that you are impacting others. So you actually begin to build an understanding of who you are through the eyes of others. So in the spirit of power being granted and power being about impact, we all need to know about our impact through the eyes of others. That kind of awareness can lead you to some choice about how you want to impact others, and some choice about how you are impacting others. So you can start to align with how it is that you'd actually like to have an impact, what kind of power you want to be using in these kind of everyday junctures. I think it matters to be aware. And it's a certain kind of willingness and curiosity and even courage to be able to ask that question, and to let people know that you're curious about how you've impacted them, and to ask for that kind of feedback. I like to use the rubric that awareness leads to choice, leads to the possibility of change. So for all of you who are asking how it is that you can actually change your level of power, some of the sequence starts with building awareness of your impact, and then creating some choices for yourself, choices that are hopefully aligned with the values that you care about, and perhaps can resolve the dilemma of feeling misaligned with organizational values or getting more intentional about that alignment. And then you're in a conversation about change, but there are a number of steps to the process. The next piece I want to talk about, just to set a frame before I take some more questions, is about psychological safety. So if we're talking about building a kind of psychological safety that promotes power, it's a basic skill set for being able to create a kind of power that has integrity, has possibility of mutuality, where you can actually collaborate with people. These tend to be the kind of workplaces people actually want to participate in. So Amy Edmondson at Harvard has this definition and some very nice work around psychological safety. And she uses this definition that it's a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. Takes us back to our question about vulnerability, that vulnerability is not just an individual kind of risk-taking endeavor, it's also more or less possible based on the group dynamics in the team and the environment that you're talking about. So power is more easy to hold, if you will, or more easy to create connection and to kind of display strength and be perceived as having strength in an environment that has psychological safety, where there's a broader bandwidth of being able to share your voice and talk about your concerns and add your opinions and contributions and ideas if they're welcomed in a team where you don't fear repercussion for taking the risk of speaking up. So if we dig into this a little bit more, we can talk about what happens. What does this look like? And see some of the aspects that show up in a team or a group or an environment that has some psychological safety. These are versions of connection and power in some ways, where people can feel a sense of acceptance of their views and also will respect others' views. They'll explicitly try to trust the information provided, which is not the same thing as necessarily agreeing with it. And then produce involvement in ways that matter for people. We see a lot of these stories coming out of Amy Edmondson's work that you might recognize from stories that are in the public forum as well. Stories like the Korea Air crash a number of years ago, where the people who were in the cockpit were not sharing information with the espoused and designated leader. Just was against cultural and industry norms to correct the pilot. Complex example, but worth naming. From Amy Edmondson's work, we see a number of examples, often from, I think, recognizable to kind of a layperson situations, like imagining a surgeon in an operating room. And that if the surgeon is not able to create the kind of psychological safety where the ancillary functions, other people who are in the space supporting the surgery can kind of correct errors. It creates a situation where the surgeon doesn't have all of the information available to him or her. So it's a situation where we can actually really understand that we want fewer errors. We want there to be learning captured in real time. We want there to be increased learning, not only across surgeries, but across minutes. And those teams really need to be coordinated. So psychological safety matters. We're going to kind of imagine it in the operating room, but we can also think about how it would, if you're not, you don't have to be a surgeon. And I imagine that we don't necessarily have all surgeons on this line, how you can actually create that in your domain. So here are some of the things that people can do, whether you have explicit leadership position or you think of yourself as being able to have influence in your teams. You can actually encourage psychological safety and speaking up with some specific behaviors. Curiosity, very powerful connection technique. To be able to invite people's voice, for them to be able to show their strength, for you to invite grit and determination on a team level. It really matters how a leader invites this, by giving people voice and asking for opinions and respecting their inputs. It matters that you solicit people's perspectives and expertise and thoughts and reactions. And so we're going to do some more of that today, but let's taking some of the questions that have come up. Of course, that's a process of attending to them. So while right this moment, I can see some of the questions that have come in. I have not let you know what they are, so I really want to get to that. So the last piece for us to pay attention to, two pieces here for us to pay attention to, are these pieces around feedback. And I put up this Shelley Carell slide about feedback because she's been doing some very nice work on this question of what's the impact of power on women in the workplace, and really putting her finger on the impact of vague feedback. But I'd like to make the point that it's not just women who are getting vague feedback. We are awful at feedback. Most organizations are terrible at feedback. The large systems are not working. The annual feedback idea is certainly not often enough, and people are often ignoring those systems, or they're not well designed to actually help people to grow and develop, or they're too late, or and certainly here they are vague. And so when we are underperforming in general, we can see that happens. It's easier to see, kind of in a canary in the coal mine kind of way, with people who are underrepresented. And so often women are underrepresented in some organizations. And so we see that feedback that's not well given is keeping women from being able to develop. So specifically with the women, they're not getting specific feedback. People aren't telling them, here's exactly what happened, here's what needed to have happened, and here's the gap in what you did. And so this is happening for everyone, but it's really showing where there's perhaps not enough connection. Part of the idea is that, maybe the men, as they're walking down the hall, feel a little bit more comfortable to tell a little bit of truth with more detail, where people are a little bit concerned because the conversations are often between more senior people and more junior people, often from a more senior man to a younger woman. And there are concerns about being offensive, or not being able to handle the conversation, or not simply enough connection between the two to be able to tell the truth that would help the woman to be able to grow and develop. But this is for all of us to be able to think about. So in the model that I offered already about connection and strength, I think there's a way for us to make feedback more powerful. And so I wanted to offer a glimpse of that today. That thinking about connection as empathy, and thinking about strength in feedback as the quality of the data that you offer, we can actually say, in everyday expressions of power, you can express empathy. You can see a situation the way that other people see it, and you can find merit in their perspective, and you can express understanding of where they're coming from. That in itself is building everyday power. People will grant you more power to know about them, to know about their story, to connect with them, to influence them, to impact them, if you can do this. You, of course, need to have something useful to say. There needs to be quality to the data that you're offering, that you can tell them what situation you're referring to, what their behavior was, and what impact it had. So there need to be both things happening. But if you can do both of those things across situations for people who are similar and different to you, you might be able to have a very nice impact on creating a little more power by helping people to grow and develop. And then this last piece around developing alliances that support you. I think feedback is a certain kind of alliance. It's an alliance around helping people to develop and grow. It's even more powerful if it's mutual, a kind of mutual power shared through feedback and developing each other. But you can also think about alliances that are opinion-based, as well as learning-based, as feedback is learning-based. And I wanted to get into this conversation, the idea of promoting alliances and connections that help and support you, so that you feel a greater sense of psychological safety as you're moving through your world. So I think it's time for us to take some questions and to get your voice in here, because I'm going to use these key leadership and mindsets to answer some of these questions. And hopefully we have enough of a shared understanding of what we're talking about here. that I can answer the questions with those contexts in mind. So, so I have a question from Nate Wong, who is asking, hi Nate, good to see you too. Thanks for the personal reach out. He's asking, I'm curious how you would put this in the context of power structures. For example, if an individuals have an enlightened view of power that's different than the system's view and use of power. So thanks, Nate. I think this happens all of the time, and it's one of the reasons that people are concerned. I was recently with an SOM alum with whom I've been in relationship after she graduated for years. We were sitting in front of my fireplace, and one of the key questions that we were really talking about from both of our perspectives, but particularly about her situation, was that she'd recently been promoted within a very large, high status company. And you know, if that alum has a sense of connection to her values as being, you know, someone who really cares about promoting the kind of power that we're talking about here today, one that has a connection to values and a sense of integrity and a sense of mutuality and creating environments where people can thrive, is it the case that in a kind of major multinational corporation with a lot of pressure for producing revenue and outcomes, that the pressure for more conventional power, which we often interpret as kind of force or a kind of Machiavellian way of thinking about the ends justify the means, can there be a peace between those two? And so your question, Nate, I think puts the finger on the, some of these kind of key dilemmas of people who worry about power. Part of the form of the question is, can I be myself and fit in with the organization? Can I actually move along and be promoted in the organization in a way that people will recognize my strength and recognize me as a full-on member of the team, and yet still stay in alignment with my values and be the person that I want to be? And so some of these ideas of building alliances that support and evolve you are really quite important. Find the people who in your organization have a sense of connection to their values. Sometimes we're overly kind of almost fearful about what we think the organization is about. There are good people in all organizations. You might not be able to find them if all you're doing is perceiving them from the kind of typical team meetings, because the team meetings are about content and about producing some product. And so you actually have to make the time to get to know your colleagues and peers. This doesn't have to be necessarily in long lunches or weekends away, but you can imagine inviting people to tea or asking person after a meeting, hey, what did you think about that meeting? But making sure that you're not over relying on your stereotypes about what the organization is about and what its people care about, and B, over relying on your work standing for itself and that you don't need connections. You absolutely need to be known and seen, and this is one of the ways of kind of finding your way in an organization that where you might not be able to see what people really think and care about, because the organization doesn't necessarily create visibility of those conversations. That said, there's often a more conventional mindset that dominates. And so over time, you want to be able to build the kind of influence and power where in your teams, you can create psychological safety and people will understand that you're a kind of leader who has empathy towards their situation, will help them to be able to grow and develop, where you give feedback that promotes mutual power, and that people actually want to work with you because you're the kind of leader who has held on to those values. So I have a number of different questions here. Let's see if we can take some of these. So I have a question that says, I work in asset management. So what it says to all panelists, people can see, everybody can see these questions? Okay. So I work in asset management industry, and I'm in my first year of full-time work experience. I'm experiencing power usurping from my teammates because it appears an ability to call someone's mistakes out is the rewarding goal. Yeah, okay, thank you. It has made me resent working here, but I really want to go on, and leaving after 1 year is not good for my CV. What do I do? So this is another example of, maybe it's an example of the last question, of a kind of conventional exchange or idea of power, that power is power over, and that we're competing with one another for power. And it sounds like, this person who sent in this question doesn't want to work that way. It's a really nice example of feeling a values conflict. The way that you actually want to exchange and build power with your colleagues is not reinforced by the organizational norms. So first of all, to the person asking this question, I want to encourage you to do what I just suggested. Make sure that you're not over-interpreting out of your limited data set, because sometimes we can be overly influenced by negative events from peers and colleagues in the workplace. Make sure you're getting to know other people as well, that you may have a skewed data set from the people who are usurping your power, and you haven't built enough of a relationship, or you're not attending enough to the other people on the team. I want to say, you of course may be right that this is entirely the picture for everyone, but this might be also what's happening to people as they're more deeply inducted into the norms of this team or organization. So that's my first point. Get to know some other people. Be kind of productively skeptical about your own data set and perspective, and see whether or not there's additional data available to you. It could be a kind of alliance and perspective that you need. We need company to be able to do a less conventional thing when you feel like you're less represented, and you're talking about a kind of power in this setting that isn't as represented. So you're going to need some company and some alliance or coalition around this. When we are using, the second part of this question is about calling out mistakes that's rewarded and that they're not supportive to new employees. This is a common error in using power. We tend to think, or some people tend to think, that this is related to the feedback model that I gave, that evaluative feedback, correcting people's errors, is all that we need to do. It's a very short-term perspective that gives people the sense that what they're doing is taking care of the product, but what they're doing is neglecting the people. And so, especially for Yale SOM graduates and other people with whom I work, I deeply want you to have the experience, of course, of being developed well in these early years. If you're only getting critical and evaluative feedback, you need to take on your own powerful learning perspective and see if you can capture the value that's there. So take the instruction that's there to help you get better. But you also need to be able to develop the capacity to feel seen and valued. The connection access also needs to happen. So you can, in some organizations, initiate the connection matrix. What you're talking about from this questioner is really not liking where you're working. It's stressing you out and perhaps not a good fit. And so at some point, you might have to make a hard decision about when the kind of cost-benefit analysis really starts to shift. I see that you have some concerns about managing your CV, but my guess is you also have concerns about the negative impact on you of this kind of experience. So I would encourage you to take both of those into account and make some call about your own power and how it's developing. It just might be time for you to take care of yourself. So those it's an important perspective to keep in mind. We have so many questions here. Thank you for all of your questions. I'm just going to randomly choose another one. There are so many things coming in here. I want to take some of the questions that came in earlier, and I'll choose some of the other ones. So a question from, can I say the name? A question from Alyssa. Hi, Alyssa. Alyssa says, I just started a new job at a small company. There are a handful of leaders and loud voices, and I'm trying to balance building power with trying to understand the existing power dynamics at play. Any advice on how to assess current power structures in the company and how to build influence without coming across as trying to take over territory? Yeah, so Alyssa, another great question. Very sensitive you are, of course, to both managing personally yourself and managing the interpersonal dynamics and managing the context of understanding the group and the culture. So you have this whole ecology built of all of the things that are on your plate. I appreciate your bringing that all to the table in your question, because many people will try to just manage one level, but it's actually all happening at the same time. It's part of why managing our power is really hard if we're trying to get a really simple frame and try to get sort of a single answer. So thanks, Alyssa, for the bid towards complexity and towards managing some of the ambiguity, especially during a volatile and important time as you adjust to the new company. So first of all, give yourself some time. And you say you're only 4 weeks in. And so give yourself some time, but while you're giving yourself some time, you might use that productively. You can really use that time to build some connections. Many people come into organizations feeling like they have something to prove with a bit of chip on their shoulder. And so they use those first 90 days to demonstrate that the hire was correct. And while that's not necessarily time poorly spent, you might, people tend to overlook the really key importance of those first 90 days for people getting to know them also personally, for creating connection. So let yourself get to know people and ask questions and be curious. It's a way of actually producing psychological safety as the new person for you to be curious about other people's perspective and invite their voice. And if you can, to ask directly about how they have been successful, how they understand. You might want to decide for yourself if the word power makes sense for people, because we have so many stereotypes about what power means. But you can ask, how do people actually thrive here? What does success mean here? What are some of your experiences with that? That will give you a view into all the questions that you're asking, as well as give people a chance to build connection with you in a mutual way. I'd love to sit down and hear how it's going soon. We have another couple of questions. I'm going to take one of the questions that came in earlier. Someone asked, I see so many self-professed hustlers with an inauthentic in-person or social media presence. I want to wield more influence, especially because underrepresented voices deserve more power and influence, but I fear losing authenticity. Once you lose people's trust, I imagine it's difficult to regain. So this is a great question. I think at some point at Yale School of Management, we were voted the #1 school in kind of integrity, which for many students was really about authenticity and especially connection to values. So I'm sure many of the alums and current people on this call who are affiliated with Yale SOM would recognize this as a feature of our culture, that authenticity matters to especially to the students, but I would say, since I'm on the faculty, it also matters to the faculty. We are graced with this question about authenticity, because especially with Alyssa's question that we just took, people sometimes feel pressured to be inauthentic to fit in. And here, since this question has a question about underrepresented voices, people who are not in what they perceive as the majority opinion-wise or demographically may feel a certain kind of pressure of being onlys, a certain kind of pressure to fit in, or that they're standing out a little more. So authenticity, you can actually be authentic about that dilemma. You can actually talk with people about experiencing that. People actually might know. But it can actually just be a source of grit and determination for you to actually name that, hey, I'm trying to get used to this place here. And, since there aren't a lot of other X, Y, or Z, however you perceive it, I'm curious what other people have done to be able to adjust here. And so naming a dilemma is actually an authentic way to let people know what you're dealing with in ways that they've already adjusted if they're not new. So I'm connecting this to some of the last answer that I gave to Alyssa's question. The question about fearing losing authenticity, I would point you to the capacity to recover, that we're actually much more robust than we think we are. And, so I wouldn't play a kind of single game, assuming that every interaction is over and will never happen. If you take a mindset of thinking of all of your interactions as repeated games, you can allow yourself to recover and to build connection and capacity over time. Not everything needs to be 100% accomplished in a single interaction. So you can allow yourself to become increasingly authentic over time. Give yourself the kind of time to adjust to the environment. And so you can think about a kind of appropriate authenticity. So you don't have to lie, certainly, or necessarily misrepresent yourself, but the kind of authenticity that you display when you're just getting to know someone and at a team is not necessarily the same level that you would have a year later. And so you can be authentic about where you are in building relationships with people, and let it be authentic and appropriate to the level of development and how long you've been there and what level the relationships are in. You don't have to overdo it in the spirit of being true to yourself. You can be true to yourself and saying, I'm giving myself time to get to know this setting and myself in this setting. And give yourself a chance to be yourself in process. The question from Billy Marks: how would you extend these concepts to a job search process? Power seems too much from the employer and not from the job seeker, and there are very few opportunities to create meaningful connection or psychological safety. Thanks, Billy. And I think of interviews as a real opportunity for mutuality, actually. We tend to think of them as unidirectional, as though the interviewer sets all of the terms and the interviewee is in just passive recipient, cooperative mode and must roll over to anything that comes his or her way. But I think we're really missing an opportunity for mutuality and connection in that you absolutely can create meaningful connection and psychological safety in an interview if you think of it as an opportunity not only to display strength, but to create connection. Every human likes to be asked questions about themselves. People like to know that other people are curious about your experience and perspective. The interview is a huge opportunity to be curious about people's experience and perspective and why they like the firm. And so, Billy, I would say that's an underutilized opportunity. When you come into an interview and accept all of the terms without expressing any curiosity right away, or even looking like you're curious, leaning forward towards the person or otherwise exhibiting interest in them, you might miss an opportunity to set some assumptions and some stage about that start to create some mutuality in the conversation. It is, by the way, a display of everyday power to be able to do that in an interview situation. I encourage you to try it. We have time to take one more question. Last question we have from, let's see. How do we evaluate, from Jonathan Jacobs, how do we evaluate how we are leaving other people feeling? So a question about our impact in the emotional intelligence domain. So, if you're not great at reading other people, or you don't even know if you're good at it or not, how would you ever know about the impact? Well, first of all, thanks, Jonathan, and appreciate the question. It's important to know actually how accurately you read emotion. If you are someone who reads emotion accurately, then you might be able to trust some of your judgment. But part of the assertion is that emotional intelligence kind of plays out a kind of normally distributed fashion, so that some people are quite good at reading emotion, some people are pretty bad at it, and most of us fall somewhere in between. So most people need some feedback from others. So part of the idea of being able to develop the kind of relationships in which there is power and mutuality is that you can develop relationships where people actually give you feedback about your impact. And so you actually can kind of ask people directly. It's part of what we're doing in the course that I create, the big elective. that giving people the skills and context in which they can get real feedback about the emotional impact they leave on people. But absent the ability to develop or those relationships being intact where you can actually ask, hey, how did you feel about that? Or how did you feel about what I said? Or something that feels authentic to you that you can get out of your mouth, basically with a straight face. You can start to think about getting feedback in a more formal way. You can actually put yourself in a program where you actually get this kind of information. Someone sends out a 360 on your behalf. But I would encourage you to think about over time developing the kind of relationships where you get this information and where it's available to you. The first place to start is with curiosity. So you can actually raise your awareness about what you know and don't know, and then you can build some capacity for choice that leads to change. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the questions and for the engagement. We are going to follow this up with a podcast where you can continue to submit questions. So send in your follow-up questions, and we will follow up with a podcast that continues to answer these and reflects back on some of the things that have come up today. Thanks all. Take care.